Hello everyone, my name is Felix Sadebeck and I want to talk with you about Roman cattle in the southwest. Zoo archaeology offers exciting insights into the Roman past, but the discipline is somewhat restrained by its traditional perspective, mostly treating animals as walking sources for meat and leather, or in more recent times as a proxy for human mobility. Usually they are treated as passive objects. However, animals are a fascinating part of material culture and should rather be analyzed as active agents in their own right to open new insights. Roman livestock had an impact on Roman people as much as the other way around. This presentation is a byproduct of my PhD concept, which will approach Roman cattle in an unconventional and more holistic way. Hopefully, I will convince you that it is about time to change our humane-centric perspective to achieve new insights into past societies. However, let us first take a brief look at some traditional approaches of interpreting cattle remains in Roman Britain, where the animal serves as a passive indicator for human activity. Many scholars like Mark Maltby or Umberto Albarella have drawn our attention to the peculiar butchery marks on the Roman period's cattle bones. For example, the scapula on the left has a typical hook mark indicating that it was dried or salted. The metatarsal on the right has the standardized cleaver marks associated with professional bone marrow exploitation. These and other butchery marks have been interpreted as indicative of an unprecedented specialized way of processing animal carcasses during the Roman period. They tell us about new economic branches like glue production or the large-scale trade with salted meat. Mainly Anthony King has shaped the perspective of animals as an expression of identity. In short terms, his idea was that the assumed native identity was linked to the consumption of ovicaprate meat, whereas the Roman conquest saw a shift towards more beef and in some cases pork. King related this to what he called a Germanization or Romanization of the diet. He compared the relative proportions of cattle, pigs and ovicaprates in the Roman provinces and searched for similarities, as we can see in this picture. In his concept, people in freshly conquered Britain expressed their resistance to a Roman-imposed culture by refusing to eat more pork or beef. However, there are some problems with linking diet and identity in this way. Lorna Wetherill used the concept of frontstage and backstage consumption to analyze changing consumption patterns in early modern England, and Hella Eckert adapted this classification later for pointing out the problems of ascribing identity to each and every artifact. She argued that we need to consider carefully which artifact might be closely linked to identity and which artifact might instead be consumed in a more unconcerned way. Therefore, we need to ask ourselves if the daily consumption of beef really is a deliberate expression of identity or rather just a way of filling the stomach with whatever was available and affordable. But then, what other aspects of Romano-British society can we analyze through faunal remains? A recent and exciting development is the analysis of isotopes. Several studies have used the strontium-stable isotope value of cattle and other animals to demonstrate the potential geographical range they had traveled before entering the record. Together with oxygen isotopes, they also reveal potential patterns of seasonal movement, as can be seen in this graph. On the left, we see the isotope signature of a cattle tooth, where the changing strontium ratio in black correlates with the changing oxygen amplitude between summer and winter in white. This indicates seasonal movement to other pastures. And the sheep on the right, however, has an unchanging strontium signature throughout the seasons and was thus most likely not driven to distant pastures. The studies of isotopes enable us to use animal remains as a proxy for human mobility and thus offer important new insights into the organization of past societies. Recent examples of such approaches to Roman livestock are the studies of Michael Groth's team or of Gundula Müldner and Delphine Frémondon. However, the animals remain a mere proxy for humans, be it for economic activity or mobility patterns. But I propose a different point of view, where ancient animals are analyzed as active agents, influencing the human and social patterns around them. Furthermore, for such an approach, focusing on animals' agency, no animal is more suitable than cattle. This is because of the unique position within the Roman symbolic cosmos that cattle had, as I will briefly demonstrate. In the Roman world, an understanding of value, a baseline of economy, was very much created by comparing the value of cattle with other things. This becomes evident in the literary sources like Columella, who tells us that the Latin word for money, pecunia, derives from pecus, meaning livestock in a wider sense, but more specifically cattle. This close relation between establishing a monetary system and the relative value of cattle is wonderfully illustrated by this very early form of a Roman coin. It is a 3rd century BC, 1.5 kilogram heavy bronze bar with an imprinted cattle, symbolizing its ascribed value. Furthermore, according to Dionysius, the name Italy derives from the Greek Vitulian and translates land where the calf wandered, which is related to a specific Heracles legend. But according to Varro, the name was also referring to the astonishing number and beauty of the peninsula's cattle. And there is, of course, the foundation legend of Rome. Romulus itself is said to have laid out a sacred city wall with the aid of a bos harenos chamatheleia, 1 male and 1 female cattle. Afterwards, he sacrificed them as Rome's first official sacrifice, fostering the undeniably successful bond between gods and city through cattle. This unique symbolic value of cattle in Roman culture should remind us that those animals have been much more than just a walking source for meat, leather and glue to the humans living in the empire. Their meaning for Romano-British society exceeds economic value or serving as a proxy for human mobility. They were agents in their own right. But which questions can we ask to go beyond the traditional focus? How could we analyze the active impact that cattle in Roman Britain might have had? Let us use the Southwest as an example and look at just one possible concept to analyze those animals as active agents. Many scholars have recognized the significant increase of cattle when comparing Roman assemblages with the Iron Age. Such examples are Anthony King's well-known publications or the aforementioned paper of Umberto Albarella, who calculated an increase of roughly 30 to 50% cattle bones within the cattle-ovicaprid pig assemblages of the Midlands and East Anglia. Roman Britain as a whole remains relatively consistent with around 50% cattle bones in the cattle-ovicaprid pig assemblages. This graph from Naomi Sykes reveals yet another interesting aspect about cattle in Roman Britain. It shows the average age at death of cattle in Britain throughout time, compiling huge amounts of data to reveal significant changes in the big picture. As you will notice, the average age at death for cattle during the Roman period is much higher than in any other period. This broad picture for Roman Britain as a whole also remains valid for the Exeter assemblage. Malene Lauritsen's analysis of cattle tooth wear from Roman Exeter identifies more than 60%, ranging in the old adult senile group after Paul Halstead's classification system. This reflects an outstanding average age. It means that the increase in living cattle wandering around the landscape, if comparing the British Iron Age and Roman period, was even more significant than the number of bones alone suggest. This is due to the livestock deadstock problem. The longer an animal lives, the less often it will enter the record. Meaning that if a farmer's cattle live 8 years on average, but his goats just 1, then 8 dead goats will enter the record until 1 cattle dies. Therefore, we should keep in mind that the number of living animals you would encounter during a nice stroll in the countryside differs from what we see in the bone record. More precisely, we will see the animal with the highest average age significantly more often than it shows itself in the bone numbers. And cattle in the Roman period had an outstanding average age. Now imagine just how many cattle there must have been walking around in the rural landscape if the archaeological record shows 50% cattle bones for the cattle-ovicaprid pig assemblages, and cattle had also such an incredibly high lifespan. Keeping this in mind, we should finally move on to the Southwest. With its acidic soils, the Southwest generally has not many well-preserved bones. However, the Exeter A Place in Time project, from which we just heard in P.I. Stephen Rippon's presentation, linked the rural assemblages of the Roman period for the wider region, creating a significant composed assemblage that allows us to compare the Southwest with other parts of Britain. The non-Hilford Iron Age sites count together around 30% of cattle within the cattle-ovicaprid pig assemblages, and this number remains fairly consistent during the Roman period. In other words, while most regions in Roman Britain saw a massive increase in cattle, the Southwest stayed at a relatively consistent 30%. Furthermore, if we account for the significantly rising average age of those animals, as I just explained, we end up with an even bigger gap of living cattle between the Southwest and the rest of the South. The frequency of such animals that people would have encountered during their daily lives in the countryside was fundamentally different. There are several possible reasons for explaining this phenomenon, one being a less intensive agriculture. The aggregated pollen data for the southwest indicates indeed a significantly lower amount of arable than we see for the southeast. But I do not want to get into too much detail about possible reasons, but rather talk about the effect which this varying number of cattle might have had on the people living in different regions of Roman Britain. Now, what do cattle produce abundantly apart from milk and meat? You guessed it. Roman agriculture was heavily relying on cattle manure as a fertilizer. This is well known, and I will just let Cato the Elder speak as one eloquent example. His advice for leading a successful farmstead: see that you have a large dunghill, save the manure carefully. Or his 3 golden rules for agriculture. What is good cultivation? Good plowing. What next? Plowing. What third? Manuring. We get similar advice in all Latin agricultural writers' works, from Cato to Columella, from Varro to Virgil. You might wonder why I come up with manure at this point. But we will get there. Just follow my train of thought around one last corner. Past cultures lived in specific sensory environments, quite distinct from our own. We need to acknowledge those fundamentally different settings when we interpret the remains of the past. Chris Gosden, Linda Herkamp and others have increasingly stressed the necessity of considering the sensory environment of past societies more holistically, as ecological interpretations are often biased towards a modern Western perspective where the visual impact of artifacts is overemphasized. But of course, we cannot simply transfer this focus on the visual qualities of artifacts onto other societies. It stands to reason. As much as a big medieval church will evoke humble feelings in the visiting peasant through its magnificent visual impact, just as much will the sound of the village chapel's bell remind the same peasant constantly of his place, living in Christianity's realm. Acknowledging this, an increasing number of publications focused on considering other sensory qualities in objects, mainly concerning the potential auditive or tactile impact of artifacts. But the smell is, of course, another very real and very powerful quality. Odors form the building blocks of cosmologies, class hierarchies and political order. They can enforce social structures or transgress them, unite people or divide them, empower or disempower. I lent this quote from the preface of Aroma. It is one of the few publications focusing explicitly on the smells of past societies. However, it remains in the category of human agency. Perfumes and balms of Roman noblemen are considered, expressing their exquisite taste and richness. The spices and herbs on the market remind people of Rome's vast extension and even further reaching trade networks. Or the smell of a bathhouse, demonstrating the cultural supremacy which Rome claimed to possess. But some smells are reaching even further than city boundaries. They surround the landscape, connect people and impact the perception of the world. Let us now return to the southwest and take our noses with us. When we consider the massive differences of cattle-manured arable between the southwest and other parts of Roman Britain, we should ask ourselves what impact this might have had. It must have been very different how people in the southwest experienced their daily life. Not only the visual landscape was different, with fewer villas, fewer towns, fewer streets, but also the smellscape, with fewer cattle and less cattle manure. Imagine a person on his way between London and Chichester, let us say 2 generations after the Roman conquest. This person will encounter a Roman imperial landscape, walking across extensive fields, hearing the ever-increasing herds of cattle, and indeed smelling them and their valuable dung. All those sensory stimuli will constantly remind our wanderer of this new reality, of the undeniable fact that Britain was now a Roman province. We should consider the potential impact of this, how cattle play an active part in Rome's imperial policy, even if unintended. Surely the process of cultural change will happen rapidly in such a cattle-imprinted landscape. The southwest, however, was different. A similar amount of cattle walked the area as it has before. A person wandering the hinterland of Exeter might see some new fields, some new roads, but nowhere as much as his eastern counterpart. Stephen Rippon's presentation, which we just enjoyed, clearly demonstrated the varying development between areas in the southwest during the Roman period. Dorset and Somerset were in many aspects much like the southeast. Devon and Cornwall, on the other hand, developed in a quite distinct way. There are several potential explanations for this, but I think it is worth a shot not only to ask in the traditional boundaries of environmental determinism or human agency, but also in a more experimental and unusual direction. What was the impact of a very particular part of Roman British life, of its animals? Was the constant sensory reminder of Britain's new political order, delivered by smelly arable and mooing cattle, one of the reasons why the East changed quicker? Or on the other hand, was the absence of such a dung-laden smellscape one of the reasons why some parts of the southwest went a very different path, even if they have been conquered just the same? Hopefully I was able to demonstrate with this experimental interpretation of Roman cattle that we should and indeed could find new ways in interpreting animals beyond leather and meat. If we broaden our perspective and approach Roman Britain from a less human-centric point of view, then I am sure we will find many new tales between old bones. Thank you very much for listening. It was a pleasure to speak at this conference.